Hi guys, hi. So Monday's video, April 6, 2020, we're going to start covering the major basics of the information. The other video I uploaded had to do with the updates for College Board, which had to do with the makeup of the exam, the formatting of the exam, so make sure you watch that video too. That one doesn't have an assignment, this one does at the end of the video. It's also already been uploaded to Google Classroom, so go ahead and make sure you guys check that out. Today I'm going to try and briefly as I can, go over three concepts from Unit 1. So the first one is developments in East Asia, 1.2 is going to be developments in Dar al-Islam, and 1.3 is going to be developments in South and Southeast Asia. So we will go ahead and get started with first developments in East Asia. So a little bit of the context leading up to the year 1200, because that's when technically AP World Modern, the class itself, starts. So during this time, in a very largely decentralized world, the world is so scattered, the world is very spread out, there are not very many government systems that are centralized, and China has actually experienced decades of a very strong central government and control that has resulted in a very prosperous China. So the fact that China has been able to control its government, have this very efficient control, has made it very successful. You have one of the examples known as the Qin dynasty. They introduced a very strong central bureaucracy, meaning that basically the emperor would choose people to be in charge. Later it would evolve into like the civil service exam, and so people would earn their position through a merit-based or a meritocracy type system. That would actually remain similar or the same. It's a continuity that would change and then expand further under Song China. Which shows an example of a continuity in East Asia. Then you have the Tang dynasty, which did help improve agriculture. They also helped improve roads and canals, which helped to encourage foreign trade, and it allowed Song China to be probably pretty much one of the biggest, if not the biggest at the time, economic powerhouses of the world in the year 1200. So bureaucracy in China, what that looks like, they had a highly centralized imperial bureaucracy. So simplify what that means. Members of their government were required to take these merit exams. They called it the civil service exam. So the picture you guys see actually shows you an image or a depiction of these gentlemen who could take this exam. The exam was the same. They would study for it, they would prepare for it, and then based on their performance on this exam, they were placed in certain positions in the government. And so it's kind of similar to the way that you guys take ACT and SAT. The only negative things were about the civil service exam is that even though it was open to male citizens, the ones that tended to do the best on it were going to be the ones from the upper class or the elite class, because those are the ones that actually could afford an education. And so they did tend to do better on these exams, and so therefore they got better jobs in the bureaucratic system in China. So under the Song China, they would actually expand imperial bureaucracy. They made it easier for lower class people to take the exam and then to enter the government. However, even though this sounds like a positive thing, it would actually hurt China in the long run, Song China, because what it did was that it created a whole bunch of other positions, like more positions in the government, and then it became really expensive for them to be able to maintain this. And so they were trying to pay out a bunch of these government jobs, and it was pretty difficult for them to have a balanced budget. The Chinese meritocracy system, did provide some upward mobility, more than any other hiring system in the world at the time. So because social classes were so well defined in certain areas of the world, it's very hard to move up socially, and this meritocracy system based on merit, based on what you can do, how you can perform, your efforts in general, that was one way for people to be able to move upward socially. Some innovation in Song China, you have the creation of the Grand Canal. There's actually a picture of what it looks like there. So canals are man-made, which means they would have had to have been constructed. It helped increase trade. If you notice, it starts in Huangzhou, and then it goes all the way to Beijing. That is because Huangzhou used to be the capital of China, and then now today is currently Beijing. So it actually goes from the old capital to the new capital. You also have the creation, or the production, I should say, of steel and iron, which did allow them to create stronger farm tools, and then to create more efficient weapons eventually. You also have champa rice. Champa rice is very high caloric rice, which means good nutrients. People, again, are eating better, so better diets mean longer life. It was able to grow in dry soil, which eventually meant that people could grow it year round, and that created a surplus in food. So that's always a positive. You don't have to worry about people starving. They were also really great artisans and merchants, especially in terms of porcelain and silk. Porcelain is that white kind of, for lack of a better word, china. It's the fancy stuff that they make plates out of and vases, pretty much stuff in your grandmother's cabinet that you're not allowed to touch. And then silk is the very, very soft fabric that they would have a monopoly on for a very, very, very long time. Royalty usually wanted it. It signified power. It was a status symbol. It's really, really soft. And so people enjoyed these luxury items that pretty much weren't able to find anywhere else in the world. Religion in Song China, there's 3 of them that we should be familiar with. There's probably more, but these are the ones that are probably going to be either questioned or asked if the question about China pops up. So you have Confucianism, which is the first major religion in Song China. It emphasized filial piety. Filial comes from fili, which is son in Latin. And so basically loyalty or obedience of the children. And we talked about this idea when we talked about Confucianism. The idea that men are the head of the household. You have to respect your elders. There is a position for everybody to follow, a role for everybody to follow. And you have to kind of just nod your head, not ask questions, and go with the flow and just do what's expected of you as far as your role in this family. And it has a lot to do with the men pretty much deciding everything in these families. Buddhism would then come to China via the Silk Road. Buddhism originally is an Indian religion, but it would travel through missionary work as well as through trade. It would later combine with Taoism to create a version known as Zen Buddhism. Buddhism, even though it is welcomed amongst the lower groups in China, it's not very popular with the scholars or with the educated groups in China. They don't like change. They like Confucianism. They don't want to shake the boat, if you will, and they want to leave things the way it is. Then you have Neo-Confucianism. Remember we mentioned Neo when we talked about the Neolithic Revolution. Neo means new, so it's a kind of new version of Confucianism. It's not a different interpretation. Basically what happened is that because Buddhism became so popular, the idea that it was open to the lower groups and the lower caste systems, and it was open to everybody, and it embraced these belief systems. Buddhism became very popular. It became a threat to the way of doing things in China. And so Neo-Confucianism was a way for the scholar gentry, for the scholars, the educated, the intellects, to be able to now use reason to justify why Confucianism is better than Buddhism. So basically they were trying to use enlightened ideas about Confucianism tying to what is the rational reason? Why do we have to do things? Why do I have to be obedient to my father? Why do I have to be obedient to the emperor? And they were giving or justifying these reasons, again, using intellect to kind of back up that response and make sure that Confucianism kept a stronghold in China. It's also important to know that each of these religions also impacted local areas like Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Even though all of these at the time technically were independent countries, they did have a very strong Chinese influence surrounding them as well. So some other things about China, they did experience some versions of social stratification. So stratification is basically a fancy way of saying different levels of classifying people. So like a hierarchy, or the way like a food chain would work. That's basically what it means. Because China was the most urbanized land in the world, they had a very structured social hierarchy. So there's room and there's space for some social mobility to move up in the scale, but pretty much the scales are set. So the emperor's at the top, then you have the scholar gentry, those who are educated, then you have the farmers, then you have the artisans and the craftsmen and the merchants, and then at the very bottom you have the peasants and the poor. So that's pretty much how everybody was viewed in terms of value, in terms of importance. Women were pretty much on that bottom part of the scale. Women had to defer to men for all things: marriages, decisions, property. When women did not go to school, you pretty much belonged to your husband, your father, or your son. It just depended. Every male member of the family was responsible for the women in his family. Some of the things that you see also pop up during this time as a way people are going to disagree or say different things about this, but you have the cultural practice of foot binding in China. And there's a picture of a woman that actually shows herself binding her own foot. I showed you a picture of this in class. So basically, in a very crude version, when a woman is very, very young, so a girl, I should say, her feet are taken and then her bones are broken. And so if her foot, kind of representative like of my hand, her fingers, toes, are broken and then bent over, and so it creates kind of like a weird little nub looking thing, and then they're bound really, 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 really tightly. That way when the bones set, the foot remains extremely, extremely small. Some people say that this was a beauty classification, recognition. It was a status symbol. Some people said like smaller feet was a well-desired thing right now. You know, eyebrows and eyelashes are like all the rage or whatever. Back then, apparently in Song China, it was very, very, very tiny feet. And I'll show you a picture on another slide. But really and truly, it probably was more for reinforcing the fact that women are controlled by men in all aspects. And it makes it really hard for women to run away from these men. Then you have the tribute system in China. The tribute system basically was the fact that China was so powerful that it was able to collect a tribute from smaller or weaker countries. And tribute could be paid in the form of money or in goods. So if you didn't have money or gold or silver to pay them, you could pay them in other ways. Food or labor, or you could work out a different kind of barter system, a trade system. Like I mentioned previously, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, there are several influencing factors that popped up from China in these countries. So you have Japan that adopted Buddhism and Confucianism. However, Japan was not as centrally governed. That is because at the time, Japan probably was overrun by a bunch of warlords. So they didn't have a very centralized or a very strong political atmosphere. Korea was very close to China in terms that they had a centralized system of government, and they also used Confucianism and Buddhism. So out of the three, Korea was probably the closest in terms of similarities to China. Lastly, you have Vietnam. Vietnam did adopt the Chinese system of writing, but they did resist what is called sinification due to their unique views on family and culture. Sinification is the adapting or the accepting of Chinese culture on a non-Chinese group or an area or a region. So the pictures, the top one kind of goes to show you a little bit more about the tribute system. So we also talked about this in class. This is called the kowtow, where basically you have to prostrate yourself, or you have to like completely bow all the way down to where your forehead touches the floor in complete submission to the emperor. There can be no questions about your loyalty. You have to be 100% devoted and committed to the idea that this person is your superior and you're going to do whatever he says. The foot binding, the picture is there. So that's an actual photograph. Even though Song China existed many, many, many years ago, the practice itself, the cultural practice carried on for many hundreds of years, even into modern times. And so there are some Chinese women that had to go through this process because for whatever reason, cultural reasons or beauty reasons or whatever you want to call it, it was still being done even into the 1900s. So that's why there are photographs, and that's what a typical Song dynasty foot binding shoe would have looked like. Very, very, very small. The map that I put up there, I wanted to show you just so that you can see the proximity or the closeness of how close all these other countries are. So you see China, obviously, the largest one in the yellow, but you also see Vietnam really, really close. They share a border. You see Japan as well, which is an island off the coast of China. And then you see Korea. It's labeled as South Korea, but the part above it is North Korea. So at the time, there was no division between North and South. It was just one whole country. It's the best map that I could find at the time that gives you a good indicator of how close these territories were. All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is Dar al-Islam. I'm going to try and go through this quickly. We did cover major world religions, but we did not cover Islam. And the reason for that is because Islam comes after Christianity. So it's going to be a mixture of the information of kind of like the origins of Islam, but also the world of Islam regarding government and politics and kingdoms as well. So after the death of Muhammad, Islam is going to spread very rapidly through what I call the 3 M's. Military actions, merchants, and missionaries. So military actions, you have one of the caliphates. Caliphate is another fancy name for kingdom. The Umayyads, who basically operate under the idea of Sunni Muslims. Sunnis believe that, okay, so I told you guys to remember it this way. Sunni ends in the I, so the I means I get a vote, I get to say, I get to choose. According to Muslims who practice Sunni Islam, they believe that they should have a vote and a say in who their next ruler or leader should be. That it should not be an inherited or a passed on title, kind of like the way kings work. When you're a king and you die, the title passes on to your son. It's ancestral. It's tied to the bloodline. They don't believe that. They believe that it should be voted on and decided upon by a council of elders, and the most qualified people should be the ones who are up for this position or up for this job. Then you have the merchants, like I said, and then you have missionaries. Missionaries that traveled from parts of Spain to India, as well as from Egypt to Turkey as well. After the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate, those are Shiite Muslims, there was not one unified Islamic government, but instead a bunch of regional Islamic empires that will eventually become known as Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam. Shiite Muslims, or sometimes also called Shiite Muslims, I like this spelling better because it helps me remember the A. So this one ends in an A, and the Shiite Muslims believe that it is ancestral. It should be passed on from father to son to son to son to son, so on and so forth. It should be passed on through the bloodline. And so that's why they do have disagreements, and they are going to go to war with each other eventually. However, during this time, the House of Islam does make some advancements, major advancements in math, literature, and medicine. So, a little bit of background and context about Islam. In the 6th century, the Bedouin people were well established in the Arabian Peninsula. These are the ancestors of the what would be the Muslim people. Their culture was mostly nomadic, they were tribal, they were polytheistic, so they worshipped many, many different gods. In each of these Bedouin clans, there was a sheikh. He was the leader, he was the ruler, it's another name for king. He was kind of like the head guy in charge, with the consent of a tribal council, which was usually made up of the elders of the group, the male elders of the group. All decisions were based on allegiance to each other or to tribes in the region. Clothing was very important because clothing also helped distinguish these groups from one another. So wearing certain colors or wearing certain fabrics could identify you from far away and allowed other people to be able to see who was friendly and who was maybe not so friendly with them. Polygamy was something that was practiced. Polygamy is when men are able to take more than one wife. This actually originated out of a need to be able to care for widows. So because of warfare, because of other problems, because of even natural causes, when a woman is left widowed, meaning her husband dies, there's no one to care for her. There's no one to take care of her and assume responsibility for her. And so many times polygamy was encouraged because the idea was that these women needed someone to take care of them. And so a men could take or have more than one wife. Now, even though the original Arabs and Bedouin people are polytheistic, the religion of them included the worship of a supreme deity known as Allah, which is going to sound familiar later. Each of these tribes had what was called a sacred stone. The most revered stone and the sacred stone is the black one that is going to be held at Mecca, known as the Kaaba. We'll talk about that one in a minute. Under the original grouping of the Arab Bedouin people, there were no separate class of priests. They had lots of emphasis on tribal values that really focused on honesty and generosity. Their economy, they made their money through land routes, land trade routes via camels, and that was the basis for their economy. However, some problems are going to pop up. There was fighting on land between the Byzantine Empire, which we'll get into later. It's the version of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Sassanids, which is another empire in Persia. At one point, these two groups are fighting. And so because they are fighting and they're causing and disrupting things on the land, water travel is actually going to become more important. So water travel via the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea is going to become more popular than these land routes. So eventually the economy of these early people is going to go down. Then we get to Muhammad. So Muhammad, who was he? How does he create Islam? Founding of Islam, what happens? So he was born into the Bedouin world in about 570 CE. He was a caravan manager. During his time as his caravan manager, he met many Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. Zoroastrianism is another monotheistic religion tied to Persia. So they also, monotheistic meaning they believe in one God, similar to Christians, similar to Jews. In his personal life, he actually married a very rich widow. Her name was Khadijah. They lived in Mecca and they settled there. Over the years, Muhammad began to experience what he says were revelations that he attributed to an angel of the deity that he referred to as Allah. So Allah being the singular God, this one God, supreme God, that is now talking to him through this messenger angel. And that's going to become important in a minute. He began to collect his teachings and his followings in what he called the Quran, which is a version, or it actually translates to recitation. So he's reciting everything that this messenger angel, passed on to him. In his teachings, Muhammad criticized polytheism. He criticized tribal loyalties. He criticized commercial practices in his society, and he also called for social justice. He called for helping the poor. So a lot of his teachings, if you think back and remember them, are going to sound a lot like the teachings of Jesus. They're going to have a lot of commonalities in sync with each other. So, At first, Islam spread extremely slowly, and it was mostly through just Muhammad's teaching. It took him 3 years to get 30 followers. That's a long time to get 30 people to be able to follow him. So the process was a lot longer than Christianity would have taken. The picture that I show you guys there is a picture of what they think and what they believe is the angel Gabriel delivering a message to Muhammad. That should be important because Gabriel has connections in Judaism. Gabriel has connections in Christianity as well. If you remember, according to the stories, Gabriel is the angel that actually told Mary she was going to be pregnant with Jesus. So you're going to see some commonalities throughout all three. Most people don't understand that. They share a lot of these things in common. They think they're just all different religions or they're different gods. They're not. It's the same person. It's just different beliefs about this one God. And so Muhammad is actually viewed as the final prophet in the line of prophets. So the line does recognize Abraham and Moses from Judaism and Jesus from Christianity. However, Muhammad is not worshipped as a divine being. Where Jesus is viewed as the Son of God, Muhammad is not. Muhammad is just viewed as a prophet, as a teacher, sent to deliver the last final messages of this messenger angel. So very similar to the way Jesus did, he also came into conflict with the existing leaders. In this case, he's from Mecca, and so he's coming into conflict with the leaders of Mecca because he's challenging the social system. He's challenging the norms. And so his family, his followers, they are going to face persecution. Islam does spread. So what ends up happening, because of this persecution, it becomes very dangerous for Muhammad to stay in Mecca. He and his followers are actually forced to flee. And they flee to a city that's not very far, but it's near the Holy Land. They would name it, or it's called, Medina. This passage, or this exodus or flight, is known as the Hijra, or the Hijra, depending on how you pronounce it. It's in Medina that he actually forms the first Muslim community. However, because of his popularity, after a period of so long, he, through his teachings, through his believers, through his followers, he's actually able to return as a conquering hero to Mecca 10 years later. And then he would officially declare the building with the black stone, the Kaaba, the shrine of Islam. Islam also expanded through several military conquests after the death of Muhammad. After an area was conquered, Islamic rule was fairly tolerant. Nobody was forced to convert or become a Muslim. If people paid a tax, which is also known as a giza, they could be exempt from military service and be able to free to practice any non-Muslim faith. So the Persians also did this. They were fairly tolerant. As long as you paid your tax, you could practice and believe and worship as you pleased. There is also a strong allegiance of Arabs in culture that ties them to the religion of Islam, that ties them to this egalitarian nature of religion, and so it does become very attractive to many people. The fact that loyalty, honesty, generosity, all of those are qualities that are honored and respected amongst these people becomes very appealing to them. Some theological principles of Muhammad. It is the third greatest world religion. to come from Southwest Asia behind Judaism and Christianity. It's monotheistic, like I mentioned. It does honor Abraham and the other prophets, and it showed great respect for people who are considered people of the book, aka Christians and Jews. They do believe in salvation. They do believe that there is hope of an afterlife. They also believe that complete submission to the will of Allah is essential, and the Quran is their sacred book, and it provides guidance and laws for their followers. It's also made up of 5 different pillars. So these are kind of like the 5 foundations of faith. So number 1 is faith. You have to believe that there is one God, Allah. 2, you have to pray 5 times daily facing Mecca. 3, you have to give charity or alms to the poor. 4, they have fasting during a religious month of Ramadan. And then 5, at least once in their life, they have to make a pilgrimage or they have to return home to Mecca. Some other principles that tend to usually be controversial in terms of Islam. Number 1 is the jihad. You guys may have heard this term regarding Islamic extremists. This one is probably the most commonly misconceived version of the definition of what a jihad is. So there is a jihad that refers to a war or a holy war. But the most common definition in Islam is actually supposed to be the internal struggle. It's a struggle to strive in the way of Allah and a struggle to improve oneself and society. It's supposed to be a person's, I guess you can say, experiences on how they want to be a good person, because this is not just something that's unique to Islam. This is something that people from all different religions and all faiths, or even lack thereof, deal with on a daily basis. Is, do I want to be a good person? And it's that struggle that Muhammad was really talking about, not necessarily a holy war with it. You have to go and do a whole bunch of extreme things to get your point across. It has to do with more about your actions and your way of doing things, and how can you be the one that helps change the world. That was mostly what it was meant to be about. Then you have Sharia, which is also known as the Islamic law, as Muslim law. It was actually developed after the death of Muhammad. So it is a little bit controversial, because if you look at some of the teachings of the Quran, they are going to have a lot more freedoms for women. Sharia does not. Sharia also has some very strict laws in terms of morality, honesty. It does ban gambling. It does ban eating pork and also drinking alcohol. Polygamy is limited to now only having 4 wives. And the idea also was that they were not supposed to be able to enslave Muslims, Christians, or Jews. That was part of their laws, which are going to change later, because as we will see, things will happen in history that change this version of the law. Under this time, you also see the rising of some various Islamic states. So we talked about briefly the Abbasids and the Umayyads, which are basically the 2 dynasties right after Muhammad passes away. They will fight for power. One will take the over the Umayyads will take over the Abbasids. And then we'll see some changes. So under the Abbasids first, scholars actually began to travel to Baghdad to study at what becomes known as a house of wisdom. So it was like a school, a big learning center for people to come and travel to and learn all different things. And it was an Islamic community that helped transfer knowledge throughout Afro-Eurasia. When the Abbasids decline, they're replaced by other Islamic states. One of them is the Mamluks. The Mamluks would begin as Turkish slaves working in Egypt. They attacked and seized control of the Egyptian government and created a Muslim empire across North Africa known as the Mamluk Sultanate. So they were slaves that essentially took over and became kings. Then you have the Seljuk Turks. They are Muslim Turks who captured parts of the Middle East, including Baghdad. And they will become important later because they're actually going to be the ones that give Europe a run for their money during the Crusades as well. There you have a picture of a Mamluk fighter. So they were originally employed or used as these slave fighters, but it was kind of like when the slave turns on the master and they just became more powerful and a lot stronger than them. And so they overtook the people that were originally in charge of them. The picture that I show you there does show you eventually how the Turks are going to move and fight for control of Constantinople, which is like present-day Turkey or Istanbul, and then eventually confront the Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Roman Empire at the time. So they'll become important a little bit later. Some really important cultural and learning innovations. You have Al-Andalus in Spain. people don't actually realize this. A lot of people don't know this, but for 800 years, Spain was under Muslim control. And so a lot of our words, a lot of our language, a lot of our, even our culture and our customs come from the Arabic culture, and people just don't understand why. They created this huge, large empire in Spain, and it was really represented by tolerance. You're going to see a blending and a cultural mixing of not only Christians, Muslims, and Jews, but also a blending of just people in general, aside from religion altogether. You're going to see a blending of art. You're going to see a blending of architecture. You're going to see a blending of knowledge, medicine, mathematics, astrology. A bunch of amazing advancements were done in this place. Al-Andalus was like, you know, I know it's a really bad reference, but it's like, imagine Hogwarts, you know, this school, the best school where everybody goes to study. It was located here, besides the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And so a lot of the medical advancements took place, and academic continuities as well. So this is where you start to see doctors and pharmacists begin studying for certification tests. So back then, if you just were an apprentice and you learned from someone, you could be a doctor. You didn't really have to go to school. It was the Islamic people that really believed that there needed to be some kind of certification and some kind of training that made you qualified enough to actually be a surgeon, to be a practicing surgeon, versus just, you know, hand-me-down kind of, you know, I learned this from so-and-so. You have to learn and then become certified in doing these things, because people are trusting you with their lives. So it greatly increased the standards of medical care during the time. Islamic scholars were also known for taking learning from numerous cultures and building upon it. They would translate Greek classics into Greek classics into Arabic. When Octavian, one of the Roman generals, leaders, Caesars, burned the Library of Alexandria, a lot of the texts survived, and only survived because Islamic scholars smuggled them out of the library to other places and then translated them into different languages. So if not for them, a lot of this history, a lot of these stories, a lot of this knowledge would have been lost. They also studied math from India, and then they incorporated papermaking from China. The palace that you guys see there is the Alhambra Palace. It is extremely beautiful. It was originally a palace of Spain, but Spain was not a unified country. It was a bunch of independent city-states, and so when Ferdinand and Isabella will actually kick all of the Muslims and Jews out of Spain in 1492, the expulsion of all of these groups, they're going to assume control of this palace, and they're going to add to it and make it a lot more, not medieval, but I'm not thinking that that's the right word. They're going to add and try and make it more European. But if you look at a lot of the classical, original parts of architecture surrounding this building, they're going to resemble Arabic architecture, because that is originally who built this beautiful palace. It's called the Alhambra Palace. It's still there. Okay, now we finally get to 1.3, which is South and Southeast Asia. During this time, it's important to remember that Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism and their core beliefs and practices continue to shape the societies around this area too. These are basically, and I want to say it's about 11 different islands. So you have like Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, smaller islands as well, Timor, that make up what is known as Southeast Asia. You're going to have also a variety of internal and external factors that are contribute to state formation, expansion, and the decline of a lot of these places. Governments are going to have to make or maintain order through a variety of administrative institutions, policies, and procedures, and governments obtain, retain, and exercise power in different ways. So essentially, a lot of these places are going to have to create their own versions of government that's going to fit best for them, because they are islands, they're all independent. It does, or it is going to eventually cause conflict with each other. So some beliefs or practices important to know during this time. You have the Bhakti movement, which is a theistic devotion trend that emerged in medieval Hinduism and later acted as a catalyst to the formation and subsequent revolution in the form of Sikhism. So we'll talk about Sikhism later. So what's important to know that in terms of the Bhakti movement is that it's a version of medieval Hinduism, so Middle Ages, and still following the traditions and the beliefs of Hinduism. However, it's going to evolve and change into another religion known as Sikhism. Then you have Sufism. Sufis are basically teachers. They believe that through mysticism, you can emphasize and you can have an introspective relationship and a closeness with God. You don't necessarily have to go to church per se, or temple, or a mosque. You can have a closeness relationship with God through your own spiritual journey. You don't need a place or a location. It can be done in other ways. And then you have Buddhist monasticism. Monasticism basically is the study or the teachings of religion. So it can, if you see that word monasticism, it can apply to Christianity, Judaism, any other religion as well. But Buddhist monasticism believed that if monks and nuns were able to preserve the teachings and the social pattern behaviors, then Buddhism could be translated into any language or culture. And so you're going to see these three movements pop up in Southeast Asia a lot. You're also going to see the rise of a lot of Buddhist states. So I'm not going to go super into detail on them, because there are a lot of them. And not that they're not important, because they are. The concept, though, that you need to understand is that because Southeast Asia had so much contact with other parts of territories during this time, a lot of their culture is going to blend with each other and it's going to fuse with each other. So you're going to see some similarities pop up between all of these different empires and states that we're going to talk about right now. But it is important to know that they share a commonality, which is either Hinduism or Buddhism. So you have the I can hardly say it, and I apologize. I actually had to look this up yesterday. Vijayanagara Empire. What you see here is that they are going to be a southern power that has to ward off Islamic invasions by the end of the 13th century. So they are going to want to keep and retain a lot of their own cultural traditions and not fall to these militaristic Islamic conquerors. Then you have the Sri Vijaya Empire. It would dominate Indian Ocean trade for over 3 centuries, and that's really, really important. If you guys remember from our lessons, Indian Ocean trade was key in silk and in bulk materials as well. The Rajput kingdoms actually are a huge grouping of kingdoms. I want to say they're organized into these patrilineal clans, so these male-dominated clans in central and northern India. They're numerous in their regions. It's actually not one kingdom, but a huge compilation of probably more than 12 million people in general. Basically, it includes portions of even present-day Pakistan. Then you have the Khmer Empire. At its peak, the empire covered much of what is today Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. Then you have the Majapahit Empire. This is Javanese from the island of Java. It's not Japanese. It's not a typo. It's the island of Java. This is a Thalassocratic Empire. I know what the word means. It's just hard to pronounce, guys, when you're saying all these things and my brain is going 100 miles a minute. A Thalassocratic Empire, basically, it's like another way of saying a maritime empire. They were seafaring people. They were good on the water, Indian Ocean. Then you have the Sukhothai Empire. This is north-central Thailand. The area of this place actually was designated as a UNESCO World Historical Heritage Park site. I'm getting, my eyes are going cross-eyed. I apologize. It's been a long day, and Ariel is knocking outside the door. But it is a World Heritage site, which is seen, or can be seen there. And then you have the Sinhala dynasties, which is basically people from Sri Lanka. You're going to see a lot of that heavily still tied with the caste system of Hinduism. And it's very, very structured on people's occupations. Okay. So, done with the context. Because I mentioned your DBQ new modified version of the exam, we're going to do more DBQ practice. So you guys have a DBQ here. I'm not going to go over it with you because I want to see your answers. I'm not going to explain it. I want to see your answers. You have a DBQ there, a document. Then you have a source, so it tells you where it comes from. And then you have 2 questions. Those 2 questions are up already on Google Classroom. So all I want you to do is just answer those 2 questions for me in very, very simple, short answers. So 1 sentence per answer, or I'm sorry, 1 sentence per question. You're going to submit those via Google Classroom by Wednesday. I hope you guys have a good Monday. I'll see you later. I apologize for getting tongue-tied, but you know me, my brain is always faster than my mouth. So with that being said, adios, Bye-bye. See you later.